My wife demanded I stop visiting my elderly grandmother who raised me after my parents died, claiming it took too much time away from her. I filed for divorce instead. I'm a 34-year-old man, and for as long as I can remember, I've held my grandmother dear to my heart. When I was 7, my parents died in an accident, leaving me devastated. My grandmother was the one who took me in, gave me a home, and sacrificed her own comfort to ensure I had a decent childhood. We formed an unbreakable bond. She became my world, and I grew up determined to honor the love she poured into raising me. Years passed, and I eventually married. My wife seemed understanding at first. She knew my grandmother's importance in my life, how every week I drove across town to help her with groceries, fix any household repairs, and simply share a meal. These visits were a consistent part of my life. My wife sometimes accompanied me early on, bringing small gifts or sweet dessert for my grandmother. I cherished those moments, grateful to see my two most beloved people interacting. But as time wore on, subtle changes crept in. My wife would complain about the drive, about having to spend weekends stuck at my grandmother's place instead of doing something fun. I tried to accommodate her by reducing how long we stayed, or suggesting we go together only every other weekend so she could get some personal time. But I refused to stop going entirely. My grandmother was elderly, living alone, and deserved regular company. I couldn't bear to abandon her. The friction escalated after we moved to a different neighborhood, adding an extra 20 minutes to the drive. My wife began dropping remarks like, "She's old, but it's not your responsibility to babysit her every week." I reminded her gently that my grandmother practically raised me, and this was a way to give back. The tension bubbled. She'd roll her eyes whenever I mentioned going over on a Saturday morning, complaining that I was wasting too much time that should be spent on our life. Eventually, the arguments intensified. She'd accuse me of prioritizing my grandmother over our marriage. "You're gone half the weekend," she'd say, though the reality was I spent maybe a few hours there before returning. She began refusing to go with me at all, claiming it was boring and that she had better things to do. I didn't mind going alone. I figured it was best if she wasn't forced to come along. But that only spurred more fights. She insisted I was ignoring her needs. I was puzzled how she could see a weekly visit as neglect. The final straw happened on a day I vividly recall, a sunny Sunday afternoon. I came home from my grandmother's place later than usual because I'd helped fix a broken fence in her yard. My wife stood in the living room, arms folded, face grim. She didn't greet me or ask how my day was. Instead, she demanded, "This has to stop." Her voice shook with anger. I asked what she meant. She spat out that she wanted me to cut back drastically on visits or even stop altogether. "She's lived her life," my wife declared coldly. "You can't keep babysitting her. It's time you focus on this marriage instead." My heart hammered. She's my grandmother. She raised me after my parents died. I'm not dumping her just because it's inconvenient. She pressed on, calling it excessive loyalty and saying I should wean myself away. The sense of entitlement in her tone stung me. It wasn't just about her annoyance at the time I spent. It felt like she was treating my grandmother as a nuisance, a disposable figure in my life. That confrontation lit a fuse. My wife and I argued heatedly. She demanded I set a strict schedule, visiting my grandmother maybe once a month tops. I refused to agree to any such limit. She claimed I was ignoring her wishes, that a real husband wouldn't place an elderly grandparent over his spouse's comfort. Her words sliced deeply. I'd always believed marriage meant supporting each other's families, especially the people who shaped us. But her attitude suggested she saw my grandmother as competition for my time. Over the next few weeks, our home became a battlefield. Every time I grabbed my keys to go see my grandmother, my wife glared, sometimes launching into a tirade. "Again? Didn't you just go last weekend?" If I reminded her that my grandmother often needed groceries or help paying bills, she'd scoff about how any neighbor could do it. The disrespect toward the woman who'd raised me was jarring. I tried reasoning, explaining that my grandmother's health was declining, that she'd never ask for help if she wasn't in need. My wife remained unmoved, accusing me of infantilizing my grandmother. One day, I discovered my wife had started telling mutual friends that my grandmother was manipulative, that she demanded my presence all the time. Furious, I confronted her about spreading lies. She shrugged, claiming she had to vent, because no one understood how she was stuck with a husband who prioritized an old lady over building a future. My chest burned with anger, but also heartbreak. This was the woman I married? Someone so callous about family? Despite the tension, I kept visiting my grandmother. I shortened the visit slightly, hoping to quell the arguments. But it was never enough for my wife. She wanted me to stop altogether. Our fights escalated into yelling matches, each of us hurling accusations. She lamented that I was never around, while I retorted that she was being cold-hearted. She tried spinning a false narrative that I spent entire weekends at my grandmother's, which wasn't true. My visits typically totaled a few hours each time, but apparently that was still too much. The meltdown reached a peak when my grandmother fell ill with pneumonia. I rushed to her side, stayed overnight in her small home to nurse her. My wife blew up my phone with texts. Were you coming back, or are you seriously staying there again? This is insane. I explained that my grandmother was vulnerable, that I wasn't leaving her alone in that condition. My wife's response was chilling. Let her hire a nurse. You have a wife at home. That line confirmed how deeply she resented my grandmother. The sense of betrayal I felt was overwhelming. My grandmother had done nothing but show me unconditional love since I was a child, stepping in when tragedy struck my life. Yet here was my wife, effectively telling me to abandon her in a time of need. Furious, I told my wife I wasn't coming home until my grandmother was stable, and that if she couldn't understand, maybe we had a bigger problem. Upon my grandmother's recovery, I returned home, exhausted, only to face another barrage of complaints. The second I stepped through the door, my wife demanded an ultimatum. Either stop wasting time with that old woman, or this marriage is done. Hearing her call my grandmother, that old woman, was the last straw. Her words reverberated in my mind, slicing through whatever love I had left for her. I stared at my wife in disbelief. She'd effectively put me in a corner, choose between her or my grandmother. The cruelty of it made my blood boil. My grandmother never asked me to choose, never disliked my wife, never meddled in our relationship. Yet my wife was selfishly commanding me to abandon the one person who raised me when my parents died. I realized I couldn't keep living in a marriage built on such harsh ultimatums. I replied in a calm, cold tone, "If that's your condition for staying married, then we're done." She blinked stunned. Maybe she believed I'd cave, as I had tried to compromise in the past. But this time was different. Something in me had snapped. The heartbreak of seeing my grandmother's tearful face, worried about being a burden, plus my wife's repeated callousness, formed an unshakable resolve within me. She tried to backtrack, accusing me of being dramatic, saying she didn't mean it as a final ultimatum. But I'd heard enough. I told her I'd be contacting an attorney about filing for divorce. That spurred another explosion. She cursed me, calling me ungrateful, claiming I was throwing away a marriage for some old lady who's going to die soon anyway. Her words were so vile I nearly trembled with rage. I told her to pack her belongings and leave or I'd stay somewhere else. She shot back that she had every right to remain, but I told her bluntly, not for much longer. Our marriage is over. In the days that followed, the house turned into a war zone. She demanded I pay her compensation for wasting her time, threatened to slander my grandmother to extended family and mutual acquaintances. I ignored her threats, proceeding with the legal steps. The shock on her face when she realized I was serious was almost satisfying. Part of me still felt sorrow for the good times we once had, but I couldn't reconcile how her vile behavior overshadowed every memory. As I started the divorce paperwork, she tried multiple tactics, crocodile tears, claiming she was just stressed and didn't mean any of it, then flipping to rage when that didn't work, insisting I'd regret the decision. She even tried telling me I'd never find another partner who tolerated my obsession with my grandmother. That statement only underscored her complete misunderstanding of family loyalty and compassion. Meanwhile, my grandmother, always the sweet soul, asked if my wife was okay. She was worried the stress had unhinged her. I just held her hand, telling her not to fret, that it wasn't her fault. If anything, I felt relief that I'd soon be free of the constant pressure to ignore my grandmother's needs. My attorney assured me that, given the short duration of our marriage and the lack of shared assets, the divorce would be straightforward. It wasn't long before my wife stormed out, bag in hand, after one last argument about how I was ruining both our lives. She repeated that no one would want me if they saw how much time I wasted with an elderly grandma. I let her words wash over me, numb but resolute. The next morning, I changed the locks, ensuring she couldn't barge back in. Then I called my attorney again, finalizing the timeline for the divorce. In the weeks that followed, I concentrated on finalizing the divorce and regaining a sense of peace. My grandmother, hearing the news, offered heartfelt support. She fretted that I'd lost a partner because of her, but I reassured her it was never her fault. She insisted she didn't want to be a burden, but I told her she wasn't. My ex-wife's cruelty and entitlement were the real issue. When the divorce papers were served, my ex tried to fight for some spousal support, claiming emotional damages. But my lawyer easily refuted that, highlighting we had no major shared assets and that her demands were baseless. The judge, seeing little reason to prolong the matter, granted a swift divorce. My ex erupted in anger afterwards, sending me a string of venomous texts, accusing me of being brainwashed by an old lady. I blocked her number, refusing to engage further. Though the divorce was painful, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I no longer had to tiptoe around my own home, no longer had to justify wanting to spend time with my grandmother. Free from my ex's demands, I poured my energy into forging a new routine. I worked my shift, then stopped by my grandmother's place a couple times a week, helping with errands, cooking together, or just talking about her memories of my parents. The experience was grounding, reminding me of the unwavering love that had shaped me into who I am. Rumors circulated among some mutual friends. My ex portrayed me as a mama's boy type who was too enmeshed with family. But those who truly knew the situation recognized that I was simply loyal to the one who raised me after tragedy struck. My grandmother had never manipulated me or demanded anything beyond the occasional help. All she wanted was my happiness and presence in her final years. Comparing that to my ex's self-centered outbursts, the difference was stark. Legally and emotionally, I emerged from the divorce with minimal damage. My finances stayed intact since we had no house or big possessions to fight over. Psychologically, it took a bit to adjust, but the relief overshadowed the grief. I realized I'd been suffocating under her constant demands, nearly losing sight of what mattered most: my grandmother's well-being and the stable life I'd built on respect and love. Sometimes my grandmother asks if I'll date again. I smile, telling her I'm not in a rush. Someone who truly loves me will respect my devotion to her. She beams at that, patting my hand. The quiet contentment of our evenings together, sharing tea while reminiscing about my parents, feels infinitely more precious now that I'm not battling a spouse who despises those visits. On reflection, I see that my ex-wife's sense of entitlement, demanding I prioritize her convenience over the woman who raised me, was doomed from the start. When she tried to force me to cut ties with my grandmother, she essentially forced me to choose my family or her. I chose family because that's who I am. And while the breakup was ugly, I feel nothing but relief that I escaped an environment of manipulative cruelty. My grandmother remains my anchor, the living link to my parents' legacy. And no spouse, no matter how demanding, will ever make me sever that bond again.